Welcome. In this example, I'm going to show you how to install Dbvisit Standby version 8 on a Windows-based environment. Now, the example that I will be using in this case will be two systems, so it's two Windows 2012 Release 2 servers. On the left-hand side, I've got the primary system, which will be my Node 1, and on the right-hand side, I've got my standby system, which will be my Node 2. The two system names are just AWS DBV Win 200 for the standby and AWS DBV Win 100 for the primary. So what I've done already on this system is I've downloaded the latest installation of Dbvisit Standby version 8 onto the D drive, just into a temporary folder, and I've done the same on the standby system. Now, before we start the installation, just a little bit of a background of this environment, which is important. The Oracle software is already installed on both the primary and the standby in the exact same location. I've also pre-created a temp directory, and I made sure that this temp directory has full read-write permission to all the users that will be using Dbvisit Standby on the system. On the standby system, I've also created a temp directory which has got full read-write permission. Now, because this is a 12C installation, the Oracle software is installed as a specific user called Oracle. It's a local account that's created on the system, but it doesn't have logon permission. So Oracle is running as that user. So Oracle is installed as the Oracle user, which is a local account on both systems. Now we're going to install Dbvisit Standby as a Dbvisit user. We've created a Windows user on both the primary and the standby. The key thing is that these accounts must have sufficient permissions. So if we look at the permissions on the primary, I've created the Dbvisit account, and if we look at the membership, it's a local administrator, it's in the DBA group, which is crucial, as well as it's in the DBA group and sysbackup groups for the specific Oracle home. And then it's part of the normal users group. So it's important that we have the administrators, the DBA, and the DBA group for the Oracle home and the sysbackup group assigned to this account that will be running Dbvisit Standby. If we go to the standby system, the same user account was created there. The key thing is again the membership. So if we review that, it's a member of the local administrator group. One additional change that we have done is the UAC. So if we have a quick look at that, we go to the control panel, we look at the under user accounts, and if we move under user accounts again, we can see the user account control settings, and we've just made that the lowest one possible. Right, so what we're going to do now is start the installation. So we're going to navigate to the software folder. Now I don't have Dbvisit Standby installed on the system. This is a clean installation. If we go to the C drive, we're going to install Dbvisit Standby into the program files folder, which is the default location for 64-bit applications on a Windows system. Right, so let's start the installer. So I'm going to double click on the installer. It's going to start the installer for me now, and we can see that the setup wizard is now being launched. It's important to note, it highlights there as well, is that if you were running an existing installation, that you need to make sure you've stopped all your schedules. So if you do have a scheduler running, you need to make sure that you've stopped all the schedules. So we click on next to start the installer. It's going to show us the license agreement. If you're happy with that, you click on I agree to continue. And you now get the different options that you can use to install onto the system. And with version 8, we recommend that the central console, which is the web-based interface, be installed on its own system, separate from the systems that's running your primary or your standby database. Because if either of them becomes unavailable and your web server component, which is your central console, was installed on the one that went down, you cannot access your web central console. So ideally you want to install it in a separate system. But not everybody does have extra systems lying around that they can install it on. Even though this can be a very small virtual machine or even a Docker environment, we recommend that you run it on Oracle Linux if you can. But you can install it on the same systems. So if you want to install it onto either one of the primary or the standby node in this case, you can do that. So what I'm going to do in this example is to show that is on the primary, I'm only going to install the core components. And the core components is the agent, Dbvisit, and the standby command line interface. On the standby system, I will be installing all of the components, including the central console. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to manage this environment from the standby database. If you had it installed on your primary system and you lose your primary system in a disaster, you'll have to utilize the command line interface to activate and manage the standby environment. So in this case, we're going to install on the primary system the agent, Dbvisit, and the standby command line interface. And we can see the three components are selected. I click on next. It's then going to ask me for the Dbvisit base location. Now this is where we're going to install Dbvisit standby into. And the default location on Windows is C Program Files Dbvisit. You are welcome to change this, but we do recommend you stay with the defaults if you can. It's now going to ask us for the user that's going to run the Dbvisit services. These services needs to run as the user that has local administrator permission, and it must be in the RDBA group. So what we want to do now is specify the specific user, and I'm going to use the local Dbvisit user that I'm logged on as. It's going to ask me for the password for that user, and I'm going to specify that. If you do type in the incorrect password here, what will happen is when we create the services won't be able to start, and you will have to manually go to each service and just retype in the password. So we're going to click on install to start the installer now. And what that will do is it now goes fairly quickly through it and it installs all the different components. And as you can see there, that was a very quick installation. We now need to configure Dbvisit and the agent to listen on specific ports, and potentially if you've got multiple network interfaces in the system, you need to assign it to a specific network interface. So I'm going to click OK, and this will now start the installer script for me, which is going to ask you these questions. And if we review the questions now, we can see the first question being asked is, what is the passphrase for Dbvisit? Now the passphrase that we use in Dbvisit is used to allow us to establish a secure connection between the primary and the standby systems using Dbvisit. So I'm just going to give it a basic passphrase, Kiwi123. You can change that afterwards as well. It is in the Dbvisit configuration file. It will then ask me what is the local host that will be running Dbvisit, and in this case my local system is called AWS DBV100. We detect that and we show that, and I'm going to accept the default. It's then going to ask me to confirm the Dbvisit port, and it's going to be 7890. Now it's also important to mention at this stage that this port must be open on the primary and the standby system. Now before I started the installer, I've already went into the Windows firewall and I've added exceptions to include the Dbvisit ports, which is 7890 for Dbvisit, 7891 for the DBV agent, and port 4433 for the central console. It then asks me for the server name on the standby side, so the remote system, and in my case it's going to be AWS DBV1200. So I'm going to just type AWS DBV1200. It then asks me to confirm the port number, and this is again the port number that will be used to communicate with the standby server for Dbvisit, and I'm going to accept the default, which is 7890. It shows me a summary of the installation. I can review that. The next question that will be asked is, what is the passphrase for the agent? So the agent allows us to do secure communication between the central console and the systems that's running Dbvisit standby. So see the agent as the gateway between the central console and the command line interface. We're going to specify a basic passphrase, just Kiwi123. It then asks me for the host name that will be running DBV agent, and in this case it picks up the right one, which is the local host. It then asks me to confirm the port, and the port number for DBV agent is 7891. Again, this is open on the firewall. It's very important that this is open on the firewall, otherwise the central console will not be able to communicate with the system. Then it's going to provide me with a summary, and I'm happy with the information being displayed, and I'm going to press enter. And what it's done now is it's very quickly installed all the components and configured the configuration files for Dbvisit, the agent, and it's put all the standby configuration files in place, which doesn't require any updates. As you can see there on the screen, it shows you then a summary of the components that's installed now on the system. And we can see there that in this case, all the version numbers are aligning and matching up. And I'm happy with this, so I can now press enter to continue, which will exit the installer script and it will take me back to the install wizard. And the install wizard's now finished, and we have now successfully installed Dbvisit Standby version 8 onto our primary system. And we only installed the 3 core components, which is Dbvisit, the agent, and the command line interface. So I'm happy with that, and I'm going to click on finish now. Now, just to review and show you the services, if I refresh, because I had this already open, and we can see there now the Dbvisit DBV agent service was created, and the Dbvisit service was created and started, and they're both running as the Dbvisit user. Right, so now our services are running, and we've got Dbvisit Standby installed on our primary system. If we briefly review the install directory, we go to Program Files, Dbvisit, we can see the agent folders there, and if we look, we can see that the Dbvisit configuration directory and the Dbvisit executable is there, and we also have the standby folder under which the command line interface is installed into, plus all its required subdirectories and the conf directory that will host our DDC files. Right, so we have now installed Dbvisit Standby on the primary host. So let's quickly do the same on the standby host. I'm going to go through where I copied the install file, and I'm now going to start the installer. Again, I double click on the install file. It's going to start the wizard. I click on next. I review the license agreement. On the standby system now, I would like to run the DBV server. So I want to run the central console on my standby system. I pick the DBV server there, and we click on next to continue. And we do want all 3 of the other components as well. It's going to ask us for the Dbvisit base directory, which in this case, again, is the default C program files Dbvisit. It's then going to ask me again for the username that will run the Dbvisit standby services. It's going to ask me for the password. I'm going to click on install. So I click on OK. And the first thing it's asking me now is what's the port number that the web server, what's the port number that will be used? And in my case, I'm going to go with the default port number, which is 4433. What is the Dbvisit passphrase? Again, I'm going to keep this simple, and this is very similar to what we've done on the primary system. And it asks me then for the local host that will be running Dbvisit server on this case. And it is on the standby system, it's AWS DBV Win 200, which is correct. So I'm going to press enter and accept the default value being provided. It then asks me for the port number. Again, I'm happy with the default 7890 Dbvisit port number, and I press enter. It then asks me for the remote system that will be running Dbvisit, which in this case will be the primary system, and it is running on the host AWS DBV Win 100. And it then asks me to confirm the port number, which is 7890 as well. It then asks me for the agent details, and again, this is the passphrase for the Dbvisit agent. I'm going to keep it simple again and keep it at Kiwi123. And now it's going to ask us for the host that is going to run the agent. It provides me with a summary screen. It then starts up all the services for me. You can see there all the services were successfully started. I also can see all the component versions being installed. I'm happy with the values being provided there, and I get returned back to the install wizard, and I can now click finish.